Welcome to my channel Limelight Leaks. Please share and subscribe and hit the bell icon for new updates. Before the name Dodge became just another name on a car, it belonged to a real man, John and Horace Dodge. And they weren't born rich or famous. They were born tough. They grew up in Niles, Michigan in the late 1800s. The Dodge brothers grew up around machines, loud sounds, and hard work. From when they were young, they were special. Not because they talked big, but because they built big. Horace was the smart inventor. John was tough business guy. Together, they were amazing. They weren't fancy people. They weren't polished. What they were was really good at what they did. Everyone around the Midwest knew they were great at making machines. It's by 1900 there. Machine shop in Detroit was one of the best in the country. They made engines for boats, parts for bicycles, gears that never broke. When early car makers needed someone to actually build their crazy new ideas, they called the Dodge brothers. John and Horace quietly made the impossible happen. Spare theons. Working behind the scenes, tightening thumb bolts, and fixing the problems no one else could fix. In a city that was about to become the car capital of the world, the Dodge brothers weren't just players. They were the foundation. They didn't care about newspaper stories. They didn't pay to be famous. They had tools. They had talent. No, they had something no one else in Detroit had figured out yet. How to actually build the future. It's 1903. Henry Ford had a dream and no way to build it. He was a big dreamer, but hadn't have a working engine. His earlier businesses had failed. People with money were unsure. What he needed wasn't a notes idea. He needed someone to make it happen. That's when he turned to John and Horace Dodge. By then, their machine shop was best in Detroit. Ford offered them a deal. They could build him a good engine and parts for his new car company. He'd make them. Part of Therod, the Dodge brothers said yes. What upon next was more than a contract. It was a partnership. The Dodge brothers didn't just supply engines. They built a variety, transmissions, axles, gearboxes, and even full rolling chassis. When Ford Motor Company started, the first 500 cars were basically Ford-designed, bodies bolted Donto parts built by Dodge, and they didn't do it for just a paycheck. They'd negotiate something smarter. 10% ownership in the brand new Ford Motor Company. As Ford's success went up, so did their money, but they never chased newspaper stories. While Ford gave interviews, John and Horace stayed in the shop, covered in oil, making machines better. They were builders, not people who sold things. Without them, Ford wouldn't have had a product. The Model A, the foundation of his empire, was a machine built by Dodge. Every time a Ford rolled down the street in those early years, it had parts made by the brothers. As Ford's fame grew, so did the tension. Because the men behind the machine were being kept in the shadows. By 1908, Ford had gone from underdog to famous person. His new Model T was selling like crazy, and Thorold began calling him the genius of the century. But inside the company, something didn't feel right. The Dodge brothers were doing the same work, still building most of the mechanical parts. But the spotlight was entirely on Ford. Worse, Ford had started pushing them out of Thestry. Advertisements no longer mentioned the parts built by Dodge. Press materials focused on Ford's vision, but never on the machines that made it real. Even people. With money, we're being told that Ford had built his empire from scratch, a Lee thought the Dodge brothers knew all too well. And yet, they still owned 10% of the company. That meant profits, influence, but Ford's behavior was changing. He became more controlling, more secretive. He wanted to put every dollar into expanding his power, not rewarding the people who helped him build. Board meetings became cold. Decisions were made behind closed doors, and even though the Dodges were legally part of the company, they were treated like outsiders. That's when a decision started forming. If Henry Ford wouldn't recognize their value, maybe it was time to prove it without him. They had the machines, the workers, the money, the knowledge. They didn't need to build his dream anymore. They were ready to build their own. In 1913, the Dodge brothers shocked car world. After 10 years of being Ford's secret weapon, they ended their contract and announced a bold move. They were starting Dodge Brothers Motor Company. It's no more playing second fiddle. No more building for someone else. This time, their name would be on the hood. It wasn't just big dreams, it was strategy. Their first car, released in 1914, was unlike anything else on the market. It was all steel. Stronger and lasted longer than the wood-framed Ford Model T. It had a 12-volt electrical system. It's a better starter and a more powerful engine. It was a car designed by people who actually knew how cars worked because they had built them for years. Buyers noticed. So did dealers. So did Ford. By 1916, Dodge was the fourth largest car maker in America, less than 3 years after starting. There. Cars were especially popular with military and police forces who valued toughness over price. The Dodge brand quickly became known for strength, reliability, and working-class respect. But for Ford, it wasn't just competition. It was betrayal. The men he once relied on were now his loudest rivals. In Detroit, it was about to see a battle between two empires, one fueled by fame and the other by revenge in steel. By 1916, the Dodge brothers weren't just competitors. They were a threat to Ford's dominance. In just 3 years, they're tough. Well-built cars had taken some of Ford's market share. They had dealerships across the country. Their all-steel bodies were considerably than Ford's outdated wood-frame Model Ts. Even the U.S. military had taken notice. Dodge cars were chosen for wartime use in World War I. Meanwhile, Ford was starting to feel the pressure. Its cars were cheaper, yes, but they were being beaten in quality. Tried to beat Dodge by making prices lower, but buyers were catching on. Dodge meant durability. Dodge meant value. Dodge meant not being treated like a number on an assembly line. Behind closed doors, Henry Ford was furious. The men who had once built this empire quietly in the shadows were no center stage. And worse, they still owned 10% of the Ford Motor Company. Every time Ford made money, Dodge made money, too. It wasn't just rivalry, it was an insult. Ford's solution? Cut off the money. Starve them out. He decided to put company profits into a massive factory expansion without paying shareholder dividends. That means Dodge brothers wouldn't see a cent unless they took action. So, they did. What came next wasn't just business. It was war in a courtroom. In 1916, the Dodge brothers filed a lawsuit against Henry Ford, accusing him of deliberate telesting shareholder profits to fund personal ambitions. The core issue, Ford stopped issuing dividends, hoping top-hush minority stakeholders like the Dodges out of the company. But the Dodges weren't backing down. It's food for what was rightfully theirs. The case became a media firestorm. Ford portrayed himself as a man of the people, investing in workers and growth. But the Dodges revealed the truth. Ford was manipulating the system to gain total control, freezing out the very people who helped rebuild him. Courtrooms filled with lawyers, investors, reporters. It wasn't just about money. It was about power, about legacy. In 1919, the courts sided with the Dodges. Ford was forced to sue a massive payout. The brothers received $25 million and huge sum at the time. It was one of the largest corporate settlements in USA's story. Ford responded by buying out every remaining shareholder and taking full control of the company. But Python, the Dodge brothers, had what they needed: the funds to expand, hire, build, and scale beyond anything they had done before. They didn't just win in court, they won in public. But just when the Dodge name seemed unstoppable, fate stepped in. In early 1920, the Dodge empire was at its peak. Their factory was booming. Their cars were very rare. They had just forced Ford to pay them millions. So everything they had built through grit, steel, and silence was finally paying off. Then tragedy struck. John Dodge, always the face-off's business side, caught the fluttering a trip to New York. At first it seemed manageable, but within days, it got worse. Pneumonia set in on January 14, 1920. John Dodge died at just 55 years old. Detroit was stunned. Newspapers ran the story nationwide. Flags were lowered. The car industry paused. But the sadness didn't end there. Horace Dodge, devastated by the loss, a fifth older brother, fell into a spiral. His health, already weakened by cirrhosis, rapidly declined. He reportedly refused treatment. Friends said he lost the will to live. On December 10, 1920, Less than a year after John's death, Horace followed. Two brothers gone. Within 11 months, rumors exploded. Some whispered off poison, others suggested sabotage, but doctors pointed to illness, to heartbreak. No evidence of foul play was ever found. What was clear? The two men who built Ford's foundation challenged him on court and built a rival empire from nothing war. Both gone, and with them, the Dodge legacy stood on the edge of uncertainty. Because without John and Horace, who would protect what they built? With John and Horace, Dodge gone, their company. Once the fastest growing car maker in America was suddenly without leadership. Control passed to their widows, Anna and Matilda, who did their best to stabilize operations. But in the rapidly changing car industry, leadership mattered. And without the brothers, the Dodge brand began to drift. In 1925, just 5 years after both men had died, the Dodge family sold the company to Dillon Reed & Co. for $146 million. An enormous transaction at the time. The firm managed it for 3 years before selling Dodge again. It's time to Chrysler in 1928. From a business perspective, it made sense. Chrysler needed Dodge's factory's workforce and dealer network. But with each transition, Tay brothers' names faded further into the background. Their story wasn't told, their contributions weren't celebrated, and slowly, the myth of Henry Ford as a self-made industrial god went tongue-challenged. Textbooks erased them. Documentaries ignored them. Museums gave them a footnote. If that. The Dodge brothers, once the heart of Detroit's machine, became nothing more than a corporate brand. Their innovation overshadowed their fight against Ford. Their personal story buried under decades of business deals and rebranding. As the decades rolled on, their absence from history only deepened. Not because they failed, but because they were never the ones writing the story. Despite being erased from the mainstream narrative, the Dodge brothers left fingerprints all over American industry. They're all steel body design Beckham, the standard for every major car maker. Their factory model influenced production across Chrysler, GM, and Ford. Their wartime vehicle supported U.S. efforts in both world wars, even long after their deaths. But no one told that story. There were no monuments, no documentaries, even their graves. In Detroit's Woodlawn Cemetery, sat a largely unnoticed for decades. No Gadetters, no school field trips, just two marble names, weathered, silent, waiting. And yet their legacy lived on in ways no historian could fully erase. Dodge trucks, military transports, fleet vehicles. They kept moving forward. Ivana's, the men behind them were forgotten. It wasn't until recent years that their story began to reemerge. Car historians started digging. Letters resurfaced. Legal records from their battle with Ford were re-examined. And suddenly, a new generation realized something shocking. Everything Henry Ford was praised for started with John and Horace Dodge. They weren't just pseudo characters. They were co-architects of Motor City. And the fact that they had been pushed into the shadows. That was no accident. John and Horace Dodge didn't grab attention. They didn't chase headlines. They let their machines speak for them. But in the end, it cost them something far greater than a patent or a product line. It cost them their legacy. These were men who funded Ford when no one else would, who built the engines, the gearboxes, the foundations, and then walked away and built something greater with their own name, their own power, and their own vision. They went from suppliers to shareholders to rivals. They sued Ford and won. They built Detroit's first real competition, and for a time, they stood toe-to-toe with giants. But they died too young. His story belongs to the ones who live long and not write it. That's why this story matters, because legacy isn't always about who shouted the loudest. It's about who built the loudest machines and stayed silent when others took the credit. Dodge brothers never go their statues, but maybe they don't need them because of her Dodge badge. Every steel-framed pickup, every roaring engine with their names stamped in chrome is a monument in motion. And now, the story rolls forward just like it. Could have all along.